I've been doing these CoD beta videos for almost as long as I've been doing YouTube, and at first, it was the same old story. Another year, another CoD that fails to do anything other than exist as a brain-dead gaming option for people that don't know any better or refuse to know any better. That was until 2019, when they made the bold move of invoking the venerated Modern Warfare sub-franchise in a soft reboot. At the time it was announced, it seemed desperate, but the final product was anything but. It was the first time in over a decade that a CoD game felt genuinely new, and that feeling came from every direction. A new engine, good map design, fluid animations, and solid weapon feel, all while bringing back the style of play that made me love CoD as a kid back in the late 2000s. It was an incredible comeback story, finally taking the franchise into its next generation, and that's without even taking Warzone into account, which ended up being a phenomenon and brand unto itself. Despite this monumental achievement, the next two CoD games would go on to be just as misguided as what came before. The insipid Black Ops Cold War felt like an unwelcome time capsule, bringing back the old engine and with it, the very stale style of play that had come to define the complacent CoDs of years past. Then, almost as if to prove me wrong, last year's Sledgehammer-developed Vanguard, which did use the MW tech base, managed to be the worst CoD game I have ever played for one of these videos. An abject failure of game design that was falling apart at the seams. If not for Warzone's continued success, albeit with its own controversies to grapple with, the CoD franchise would have completely wiped out all the goodwill and momentum that MW miraculously clawed back. It probably also helps that its main competitors, Halo Infinite and Battlefield 2042, have managed to draw even more ire from the general gaming public with their catastrophic blunders. The field is wide open, and with Infinity Ward back at the helm, everyone's eyes are on this game. The pressure for this to be another success is real. Doubly so now that it will allegedly be the first CoD game to break the yearly release cycle and have a 2-year lifespan. Despite my love and adoration for what MW accomplished in 2019, I personally couldn't work up more than a tepid anticipation for this sequel. They didn't leave much, if anything, off the table for that game, so I had this sinking feeling that they would inevitably go crazy with kill streaks, systems, and the pace of gameplay to make it feel new and better. Because what other possible direction could you take a sequel in? Well, after a solid dozen hours of play across two platforms, PS5 and PC, I learned that they did in fact have a different direction in mind. The most notable shakeup of MW 2019 was its transition to a purportedly all-new engine. Despite launching before the release of the 9th gen consoles, it was clear from the onset that this new tech had room to grow. Unfortunately, although unsurprisingly, MW2 is yet another cross-gen release, meaning that the baseline hardware requirements are the same as they were in 2019. So on the visual side of things, aside from the more vibrant color palette, there's just not much to report. Though I will say that the weapon models and animation work are both a step above what was already amazing in the previous game.
Enemy UAV overhead.
The new engine also delivered completely revamped core gameplay, and while they haven't tried to reinvent the fundamentals, there's a lot of small details and tweaks here that really do add up, and at times kind of jarred me after 3 years of MW. The game feels a little bit heavier and slower than before, and the guns are extra meaty with decidedly more recoil, especially as you near the end of their effective ranges, which have never been more obviously defined in a CoD game as they are here. If you go back and play most CoD games, including MW19, you'll find that SMGs and ARs have traditionally had more crossover in their effective range than not. And ARs could pretty often make long shots with minimal effort. At least for me, that was not the case here. My SMG would hit the wall and get outgunned by an AR at range very quickly, and vice versa. Now, it's not like you're playing Counter-Strike, it's honestly more like Battlefield, but it's still a huge shakeup from the standard of never really thinking about any of this, and that's probably the point. This is going to make players not only more conscious of their weapon choice and encourage them to utilize more of the roster, but add more depth to each weapon, as the pros and cons of each one I tried were more transparent than anything I remember from 2019. All of the flourishes that debuted in 2019, such as tactical sprint and mounting, make a return here, along with new additions that very naturally fit in alongside them. Players can now hang off of ledges, peek over them, and shoot if they have a pistol. Sliding from sprint is still here, but now you can also dive and land prone, which at first seemed inconsequential, but with some ingenuity might just be a game-changing mobility mechanic. One of the cooler things I noticed seemed to be unique to the 5.7 variant of the M4. When reloading, you can pull out your pistol and the SMG is shifted to your offhand. The last two, and perhaps most noticeable changes, are by far the most contested. First off, no reload cancelling, at least once the animation has reached the point where the magazine has physically left the weapon. Reload cancelling is one of those things that is so ingrained in me as an FPS player that I don't even think about it. Consequently, this is extremely noticeable and I continued to fumble with it throughout the duration of the beta. The second change is the removal of nameplates when looking at enemy players, which I might have been fine with if in-general visibility wasn't so poor. Much like Vanguard last year, I felt that the visual recoil, particularly at range, was obscuring my targets, and I was often losing players in shadows and behind UI elements like capture points and domination. I don't think enemies need to have a big red outline, but when I know there's an enemy in an area and I still can't see them when I peek, that's an issue. And it was definitely my biggest issue with this beta, costing me countless deaths and kills. Visibility gripes notwithstanding, all these design choices contribute to this game playing differently. Maybe not drastically so, but noticeably. I said in 2019 that they incorporated a few milsim features into CoD's arcade-style format, which worked well. What they've done here is not only double down on that, but embrace it as an overall design philosophy, which is a very surprising and potentially even risky choice for a CoD game. I respect the hell out of it, and much prefer it to the alternative of going more crazy, more arcade, but my first impression is that they may have gone that extra 10% too far with it. I'll admit that some of it is me needing to readjust after years of sinking hours into the old game, but I look at something like reload cancelling and wonder what the point is. With the way they've implemented it, yes, it's very realistic, but does adding such a harsh punishment for reloading really have a place in what is still ultimately a casual arcade shooter? I'm not seeing how it brings value to the gameplay loop, and even with the weapon range and recoil, something that I'm more on board with, it might be just a tad bit too severe for what this game is. With the kill streaks, which I thought would be one of those key areas to go nuts with, they've mostly maintained what they already had, with some minor additions at the lower end like the cluster mine, and even some nerfing at the higher end. I didn't get to use everything, but the VTOL jet functions the same as it did before, though the initial bombing seems much less effective. Meanwhile, series staple Chopper Gunner gets what might be the biggest nerf ever, at least if what I experienced is the intended behavior. The 3 times I got it, it was completely stationary at what I assume is a fixed location on every map. For a small, mostly covered map like the hotel, that means it's basically useless. According to this person, it's a glitch, but I haven't seen that claim corroborated elsewhere. This conservative, almost restrained attitude persists with the supporting systems. The mostly superfluous field upgrades return, with additions like a camera, MGS5-style inflatable dummy, and Battle Rage, which gives a buff to things like health regen and sprint. The perk system sees some pretty major changes on paper, but the in-game results are less pronounced. Players now get to choose 4 perks, but the last 2 are withheld until certain timestamps in the match, though the timer can be reduced through performance. Things like Scavenger and Overkill fall into that first tier of permanent perks, but perks they've apparently decided are more powerful, such as Fast Hands, previously known as Sleight of Hand, and Ghost, are now time-gated. I don't have a strong opinion on this system, and I also didn't find it to have a huge impact on moment-to-moment gameplay, but I do find it exceedingly odd. Something like faster reloads is not that powerful, and having it bestowed upon you 8 minutes into a match isn't exactly going to change the tides of war. The closest I came to that was unlocking Hardline and having it count as the last kill I needed for a VTOL jet. Last, but certainly not least, is the Gunsmith, which receives the most interesting changes out of all the supporting systems. What they've done here is consolidate attachments and progression by categorizing weapons by platform. Something like the M4 is now treated as part of the AR platform, where the receiver package can be swapped to create a new weapon while retaining compatibility with attachments. For example, you can swap in a 458 SOCOM receiver to make a DMR and continue using the same optics. At least with the M4, they were already sort of doing this in 2019, but the implementation here is far more robust and also more realistic to how things work in real life. Outside of deeper customization, the ostensible benefit of this for the player is making unlocks far less laborious. But once you look at how the progression system is laid out, it might end up being more of an annoyance than anything. Simply using a platform is not enough to unlock all of its attachments. Each receiver set has its own progression that bleeds into the next. So if you want something like a simple 1x sight for your M4, you'll need to spend time with another receiver to unlock it. The intention here is obvious. Encourage players to use more of the weapon roster, specifically traditionally neglected classes such as LMGs. Conceptually, that's fine, but some of these weapon types are neglected for a reason, and they don't appear to have addressed that here. The DMR and LMG receivers just weren't that viable on the 6v6 maps. So they're really asking players to handicap themselves to unlock things that they're going to use on something else, which is a very aggressive way to encourage people to branch out. I think having just one shared linear progression system instead of this tree system would have been enough incentive, since you're already apt to try out weapons or attachments for weapons if you've unlocked them. I spent 90% of my time playing classic 6v6 deathmatch and domination, which featured 4 maps in this beta. 3 of the 4 are quite similar, smaller, claustrophobic with mostly indoors or covered spaces. Meanwhile, the 4th map, which is a museum, was the standout for me. It's a medium-sized play space with an almost realistic layout, which is cool, but there was a large amount of dead space in the middle and back since it's so dangerous to venture out there. I did notice some common design traits that permeated throughout all 4. There is much less reliance on interactable doors, which I know was a sore spot for many in 2019. These maps also have far less freedom of vertical movement, which I thought was a key part of what made 2019's map design work. You can still get up on stuff, but from far less places, and the places you can are extremely vulnerable hotpoints that everyone is either looking at or actively fighting over. I have to say that I wasn't particularly impressed with these maps, but they weren't offensively bad or anything like that, just a little bit dry. 2019's beta featured night vision as a sort of gimmick mode, and this beta offered up a new gimmick, third person. I remembered third person existing way back in the old CoD days, and it turns out it was actually introduced in the original Modern Warfare 2, making its return here something of a full circle moment. For me, this mode worked far better on controller than mouse and keyboard, but nonetheless, it is remarkably well conceived. It handles like any competent third-person shooter, which naturally changes gameplay, and they've done such a good job with the character models and animation work that it all holds up to the scrutiny of a constantly detached perspective. It's a fun inclusion and much more of a game changer than NVG. We also see the return of big team modes. 64-player Ground War once again copies the format of Battlefield's Conquest, though the results are just as lackluster as they were before. The flow of battle is a completely garbled mess, and without a class system, there is no depth or purpose to individual player actions. The 40-player Invasion mode fared a bit better. With a pared-back player count and no objectives, fights flowed more coherently, though the inclusion of bots is as useless as it was in Titanfall and Halo 5. Despite Infinity Ward talking up their new NPC tech. Neither of these modes are the sort of thing that I come to CoD for, but I commend them for giving it another try. As I wrote this video, I realized that my thoughts on this game sounded harsher than I imagined them to be, and that's because I do question some of the choices they made. That's not to say that I hate the game. I actually had a pretty good time. Worlds better than the last two entries, but it feels ever so slightly lost, almost lacking in purpose, and it's definitely not bringing the same level of excitement that I felt in 2019. I get the impression that Infinity Ward had the same fear I did of this game falling down the slippery slope of being nuts and overkill, but they still had to find a way to make it a new and different game. So what they came up with is going down that more realistic milsim path that they featured elements of before. In the process of doing that, they've meandered a bit, but there's nothing here that ruins the winning formula that was already established. If you liked MW, you'll like MW2 as well. As the first 2-year CoD game, this will be a solid platform to build upon, but I just can't help but feel as if the multiplayer is taking a backseat to Warzone. So many features here like diving, third person, and swimming, which to my knowledge wasn't even possible in this beta, seem to be tailor-made with Warzone 2.0 in mind. This approach of Warzone stuff going downstream into multiplayer instead of the other way around makes sense considering how insanely successful Warzone is, but I can't imagine that it was to the benefit of multiplayer's development. Regardless, Call of Duty is at least finally back on track, and with absolutely no serious competition, I have no doubt that both Warzone and this multiplayer will be successful. If you enjoyed the video, consider liking and subscribing. If you gave this beta a try, let us know what you thought in the comments, and until next time, thanks for watching.